Hey, fourth grade. Welcome back. We are on Module 6, Lesson 4 today. On this lesson, we are going to be introduced to hundredths, which is even smaller than the tenths we've been working with. And you'll see that the fractions we're using today are going to be over 100, and you'll still see some over 10. So pay attention to whether we're working with tenths or hundredths. All right, so in example 1, we're just going to break down what is a hundredth and where are we going to see this and what does it actually mean. So if you look at this first one, we want to represent 1 centimeter as 1/100th of a meter. So if you look at this first meter here, you'll see that it's split into 10 equal parts. So each of these parts would be a tenth. So that means all together we have 10 tenths here. Okay, so hundredths are going to be even smaller than tenths, and we're going to find 10 hundredths in each of our tenths sections. So this is going to look like us splitting each of our tenths into 10 equal pieces. My pen might be a little too fat for this. 4, 5, 6, 8, 9. Oh, I'm so close. I'm going to squeeze one in right here. So bear with me because that's not perfect. But each of these is going to be a 100th. So I've just made 10 100ths. Okay, so the whole idea here is that 10 100ths is the same as 1/10. So if you look at this, you might notice a pattern between your numerators and your denominators, and that pattern here is if I'm going from 1 to 10, that's going to be a times 10, but since I've got it backwards here, actually let's change that. Let's rewrite this so it makes a little more sense. So that means I know that 1/10 is equal to 10 100ths. There we go. This is going to make a lot more sense. So when I go from 1 to 10, I know that the rule would be times 10. And the bottom, 10 to 100, is also times 10. So we have changed the numerator and denominator the same amount, which means these are equivalent. All right. On the second one, I want us to model 20 hundredths. Okay. So I'm not going to split all of mine again because you can't hardly tell anyway, but hundredths. We'll just simplify that. All right, so when I think about this, I know that each of these is a tenth. So if I want to make 20 hundredths, I know that this is going to be 10 hundredths, this first one. So that means the second one would be 10 hundredths. And that means together they would make 20 hundredths. You guys told me that practice makes perfect. I think I'm in need of a little more practice. I need to get a mouse instead of using my trackpad. All right, so we've got 20 hundredths there. Pretty simple idea here. When you see your hundredths, remember we're going to have 100 at the bottom of our fraction. It'll be our denominator. What is this going to look like as a decimal? Let me show you. If I have 10 hundredths here, when I write my decimal, I'm going to write it just like I would with tenths. I'm going to start with 0 and my decimal point, and then I'm going to have 10 after. Miss Martin, why in the world would I write that 0 at the end if it doesn't change anything? Well, the whole idea is it is showing your number in the tenths and the hundredths place, so you know that we're referring to 10 hundredths even though it's equivalent to 1/10. Okay, because we know our 1/10, if we were writing it as a decimal, we would just write 0 decimal point 1. Okay, so that 1 is in the tenths place. The 0 takes it out to the hundredths place. Okay, same thing down here with our 20 hundredths. This would become a 0 decimal point 20. And again, this 0 tells me that I'm talking about hundredths and not tenths. If I hid that 0, I would see 2/10. We know they're equivalent, but the writing does make a difference, okay? All right, moving on to problem number 2. So problem number 2, we're going to be combining our tenths and hundredths together. And we're going to use number bonds to model this after we draw it out on our tape diagram. And on your classwork today, you'll have a couple problems where you get to solve with a number bond. And we're going to get to that with problem 3, but just a heads up there. All right, so I have 2/10 here. When I look at my meter stick right here, I have 10 equal parts. So I know that each of these pieces is a tenth. So to model my 2/10, I would be able to shade in 2 of them. Okay, so I'm gonna mark that so we don't forget that that is 2/10. Okay, so I also want to label or model 5/100 in the same meter stick here. So the easiest way for me to do this is to remember that if I split this third piece up into 10 pieces, then those pieces would each be 1/100th. Let's see if Miss Martin can get 10 this time. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Oh, I think I might do it. 7, 8, 9, and 10. Awesome. This is going to be a lot easier if you have the ability to print out your classwork and homework today, because with a pencil or pen, this is so much simpler to draw out. All right, so I'm going to now color in 5 of these. So I need 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. All right, so now I have 5/100 here. I have a problem though. This is an addition problem and my denominators do not match, so I can't easily add these if my denominators don't match. We learned that earlier in our fraction unit. So that means I need to change something. The easiest thing for us to change here is to change our 2/10 to hundredths. And like we saw up top, we can use the rule times 10 on the top and times 10 on the bottom to get those equivalent fractions. So my 2/10 would actually be equivalent to 20/100, sorry, 20/100. So now my equation is 20/100 plus 5/100. And so my final answer would be 25/100. Quick challenge problem. Do you know a way to simplify 25/100 into the smallest fraction possible? If you think about quarters, if we wanted to do that, we could simplify this into 1/4. If you were able to do that before Miss Martin said it out loud, give yourself a pat on the back. That means you've got that fraction mental math down. All right, so moving on to our last problem, or our last example. There's 4 parts to this one. All right, so on this one, we're gonna write our total as a decimal first, and then we're gonna use a number bond to break it down into tenths and hundredths. So something I want you to think about before we get to this is if you're thinking about a number, let's draw it like this. So say this is our ones place. Then you have your decimal here. The number to the right of that decimal, the very first one, is going to be your tenths. I'm going to call that TH, tenths. And then the second number to the right of that decimal is in the hundredths place. So if you're thinking place value chart, hundredths. All right, so that's going to help us when we make our number bonds here. Helps us define which number is which. All right, so first one, we have 28/100. The first step says to write it as a decimal. 28/100 is going to look like 0, decimal point, 2, 8. Okay, so now I want to break it down into a number bond. I'm not going to rewrite that because that's a waste of our time. We're going to just circle it and go ahead and draw the two number bond pieces down here. Okay, so it wants one to represent tenths and one to represent hundredths. So I can go ahead and get this set up because I know one is going to be tenths and the other is going to be hundredths. Okay, so thinking back to this guide here to our right, in our tenths place, it's our first box, we have 2. So that means I have 2 in my tenths place, or 2 tenths. If I look next door in my hundredths place, I have 8, which means I have 8 hundredths. And it's as simple as that. Very similar to how we just broke down that problem right above, using multiplication to get common denominators. This way we're just moving backwards, where we're taking our tenths out and taking our hundredths out to show those two values. All right, so next one, let's do it. I've got 31 hundredths written as a decimal. First, I'm gonna rewrite it, 0 decimal point 31 hundredths. Okay, and now we need to number bond it. All right, just like last time, we know one of our pieces of our number bond will be a tenth, and we know that the other will be a hundredth. All right, so looking up here in my tenths place, I have a 3, which means I have 3 tenths. Looking next door in my hundredths place, I have a 1, which means I have 1 hundredth. So if we were shading this in one of those bars like we did above, you would have 3 of your tenths squares shaded in, and then you would have to split 1 into 10 pieces and color just 1 piece of it in. All right, 2 more, and then y'all are ready to go on your own. All right, 41 hundredths as a decimal. It's going to be 0 decimal point 41 hundredths. All right, and then we need to number bond it, break it down into tenths and hundredths. Let me get a different color. All right, so tenths, I'll do this all at once. I have a 4 in my tenths place, tenth. So that means I have 4 tenths. And then here in my hundredths place, I have a 1, which means I have 1 hundredth. Okay, last one, 79 hundredths is going to be 0 decimal point 79. Just scroll up a little. All right, from here, we're going to break it into tenths and hundredths. All right, so we have 7 in our tenths place, and we have a 9 in our hundredths place. All right, so as you get to your classwork today, you'll see the first couple problems ask you questions about the models they have next to them. So make sure you're reading carefully these questions. Second set of problems, you are changing tenths to hundredths. So remember, when we're going from a tenth to a hundredth, the rule here is always going to be times 10. Okay, don't forget that. That's going to be helpful on that second part of your classwork and homework. So times 10 and times 10. And remember, whatever you do to your numerator, you must do the same to the denominator. It will not be equivalent. All right, the third section, you are going to be breaking it down. Actually, the first one's done for you. So the two after that, you're going to be using these number bonds and drawing out your decimal and then breaking it into tenths and hundredths. So you might want to look back at this screen when you get to that. And then the last two sections, you're going to be shading the amounts shown, and then you're going to be drawing a couple more number bonds. that's all for today, my friends. I hope it goes well. And as always, ask me questions if anything comes up as you're working that does not make sense. Have a great day.